I'm taking a step back, not going to talk about medical device to start off with. It's about managing your patients. And this here is an example of different routes a patient can typically take through a hospital into critical care and then potentially also out. Now, it is very important that if you take a step back and look at the bigger picture, trying to manage how patients flow through that and making sure they don't have any blocking points within that pathway is going to be critical to the overall cost of managing your patients. And one of the things that you need to do is you need to collect frequent diagnostic information at various points in time along those various stations within the pathway. And blood gases and electrolytes are actually one of the most measured parameters of the diagnostic tests for your patients within that realm. So, how do people currently actually measure blood gas and electrolytes? They typically would take a syringe full of blood, take it from the patient, and then either send it off to a laboratory. The results can come back in, let's say, 30 minutes, 60 minutes, or the nurse actually walks away with a syringe to a close-by instrument. Now, that doesn't really help in terms of doing very frequent measurements, and what we can see is that on average you do a blood gas every 3 or 4 hours, maximum maybe every 1.5 hours for critically ill patients. But everybody agrees that for these unstable patients, one should actually measure this stuff more often because you would detect critical onset of any critical conditions, deteriorations more frequently or earlier, or even improvements. If you have a patient on a ventilator, you can actually detect them, these improvements earlier, and you can wean them off the ventilator earlier. And all this actually translates, I'm told, at some point in time in terms of length of stay in ICUs, and that's where actually a lot of money gets being spent in the hospitals. So everybody agrees it should be a good thing to measure more often. Why don't they do that? Now, the one thing is actually dependency on nursing staff. The more often you measure, the more often the nurses are away, running around, going off to the blood gas analyzer, and not looking after the patient themselves. Secondly is also a rise in blood anemia, because every time you take a syringe of blood out of the patient loses blood, and these people are typically very sick. In fact, blood gas testing is one of the main sources of blood anemia within the ICU nowadays. And the third is also an infection risk. The more often you test, the more often you open arterial lines, so you could theoretically infect the patient. But even if a patient actually has some infectious disease in the blood, you're actually running around with that blood in the hospital, go into blood gas analyzer, and that can be transmitted onto other nurses who can then take to the other patients. So it's a perfect vector for actually transmitting disease. So with Proxima, we have a patient-attached, dedicated solution. So the nurse stays there, she doesn't have to go away, all blood is extracted and also returned to the patient. So what does this actually mean? You connect it to the patient, and this will move with the patient through those various stations of the pathway. There's no need for setting it up every time you enter a new station. There's no need to somehow get the data aligned so that all the blood gas tests which were done in the patients over sort of several days of episode of care are there. So you actually eliminate, let's say, a huge source of errors. And also, it saves a lot of time because the nursing staff can actually do what they need to do is look after the patients and not go and do blood gas measurements. Oh, that's too fast here. And by returning all the blood, obviously we reduce the need for transfusions and also the infection risk. And we have a very fast turnaround of time for results. So what that actually means is you can adapt your therapy much more quickly to the changes in a patient's physiology. But we looked at some data when we ran a study, and this is very interesting data because most clinicians will tell you the patient is unstable with the first 12 hours after an operation. Now here the patient was stable for about 30 hours. You can see that those values for the 3 parameters are pretty much within the physiological ranges. And all of a sudden something happens after 30 hours. The patient sort of doesn't have enough oxygen, starts breathing, and your pH and your CO2 actually get out of range. Now the clinicians didn't treat the patient based on that, and what you can see, it took 12 hours for the patient to get back into the normal range. Now the whole idea is that if you react and measure very frequently, you can actually get the patient back into that normal physiological range within 1 or 2 hours. And this extended period of being outside of the range is where people feel that you have worse clinical outcomes. So the whole idea of Proxima is measure very frequently, monitor your patient properly, keep them within those sort of tight barriers, and then the chances of them having to be managed in the very expensive parts of your critical care pathway, i.e. the ICU, you can reduce as much as possible and therefore also save the associated costs. We have started selling the product. We launched it about a year ago in the UK and about a half a year ago here on the continent. We have hired a very small direct sales team to gain first experiences of how to sell the product into the market. And we have people here in the UK, Germany, and Netherlands. We've achieved our first sales in the UK, and we also have a growing number of other hospitals who are sort of within various stages of the evaluation process. But it takes a bit of time. A typical sales cycle we are looking at is between 6 and 9 months, because you have to look at the hospital, you have to look at the way they manage their patients, because it's not about selling another piece of diagnostic equipment or another test. You have to look holistically as how to actually manage your patients throughout their pathway. And in fact, some data we have gathered as part of our evaluations actually shows that we can actually make 40 to 60% improvements in terms of turnaround times, i.e. by the time you want to start a measurement and actually have the data there. So the capability of adapting your therapy much more quickly, we have seen sort of, it's not just theory, we have seen that in reality. And the outline is we want to build a sort of customer base who will be using this routinely on certain identified patient groups. But we are a small company, and as I said, we have a handful of our own salespeople. To really get to those big revenue numbers I talked about in the past, we will need to partner with one of the bigger medical device companies who essentially have a worldwide sales force and the feet on the street. So it is our intent with the next generation of product, which we will launch next year, to sign a partnership deal with one of the big players out there. So if you look at what the company is looking at, obviously we want to achieve our first sales also here on the continent, here in Europe, get the CE marking for Proxima 4 lined up and also launch that for sales in Europe. We will be doing additional sort of clinical evaluation and small studies, and we will be publishing as we go along. But I think in terms of the real commercial traction, we are looking at that commercial deal with one of the big companies. So to summarize, with Proxima, we have a patient-connected CE-marked blood gas electrolyte analyzer, which is optimally positioned to manage patients along their pathways. It has a global market potential of more than $200 million per annum, and we have strong endorsement by leading European clinicians. We also had a recent fundraising, so we're well funded, and we got some very good specialist investors in the UK industry, so we have a lot of cash in hand to execute on these plans we have going forward, and we are very excited that the early commercial traction we are seeing with Proxima, we can actually make something big out of this. Thank you.